I could swear the air inside that old Presbyterian church weighed more than any grief I had ever carried, like it clung to my lungs, thick and suffocating, pressing down with the quiet cruelty of things unsaid. My heels echoed against the gleaming hardwood, sharp and intrusive. But beyond that, the room swallowed every other sound whole, like even the smallest noise would be an offense to the dead. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the polite but biting murmurs, it all sank into the heavy silence, and yet the loudest sound was still my own heartbeat, thudding like distant thunder inside my ears, betraying how much I didn't belong here. And, truthfully, I didn't, not anymore. But still, I came. I crossed the threshold knowing exactly how they would look at me. I didn't need to see it to feel it crawling under my skin, the tight, poised anger of a family convinced they needed someone to blame. And that someone was standing right there in heels and a black dress that suddenly felt far too tight. The moment I stepped in, I could feel the stares pierce through me like invisible knives. I heard Mrs. Sullivan's voice before I even saw her, slicing through the hush like the hiss of a blade. "She shouldn't even be here," she spat, not raising her voice but cutting deep enough that the words rang louder than any scream. I froze, my hands clenched at my sides, my fingernails sinking into the soft flesh of my palms, until I thought I might draw blood. I hadn't even made it to the third pew. She sat near the front, draped in black, her veil thin and perfunctory, barely disguising the raw fury burning in her eyes. Her mouth was locked into a line so hard it looked like it might shatter if she dared open it. Her sorrow was visible, that was undeniable, but so was her hatred, and both sat on her face like two sides of the same unbearable coin. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forced myself to keep walking forward, even though every step dragged behind it the weight of 1,000 invisible accusations. Part of me screamed to turn round, to run out into the daylight where breathing might be easier, but something deeper, something uglier, guilt, maybe, or maybe something I didn't even have a name for, anchored me in place and pushed me toward the rows of people who didn't want me there. And that's when Brooke Sullivan stood up. Ethan's sister, always the fighter, always the one ready to say the words no one else dared. Her eyes locked onto mine, fierce and blazing. "You broke him," she said. She didn't whisper it, she didn't sob. She didn't need to. It was a verdict, final and merciless, and the sound of it filled the church like a gavel strike. Somewhere behind me, someone dropped their service program, the sharp slap of paper against floor startling in the suffocating quiet. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. My mouth opened, desperate to say something, anything that might explain the impossible ache still lodged in my chest after all these years, that I never stopped dreaming about him, that I still saw his face in strangers sometime, that maybe in some twisted, broken way, I came back because I couldn't let go. But the words tangled in my throat like thorns, maybe because deep down, a part of me believed Brooke was right. The heat flushed up my neck, suffusing my face, and my throat burned from the effort of holding it all in. But I wouldn't let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of them. Not in front of the people who had already decided I was the villain in their story. I turned on my heel, ready to leave, ready to abandon whatever fragile dignity I had left. I should have known better than to show up. I should have listened to my mother when she said, "Lauren, are you sure this is what you need? It won't change anything. It won't bring him back." But stubbornness or pride, or maybe both, had brought me here, and just as I took a step toward the exit, a voice stopped me. "Lauren." It was calm, gentle, steady against the chaos crackling in my veins. The priest, Father Reynolds, stood at the altar, holding a slim, creased white envelope in his hand. His gaze was soft but unyielding. "He wanted this read aloud," he said. His voice was quiet, but it echoed in that stillness like a bell tolling. My name was scrawled on the envelope in that familiar, hurried handwriting. Ethan's handwriting. Even after nearly 2 years, I recognized it instantly. My knees buckled, and I gripped the pew beside me just to keep standing. What in God's name could he have possibly written to me? Why now? Why here? I glanced up, and the entire congregation was staring, hungry for the drama they assumed Ethan had scripted from the grave. Faces swimming with pity, disgust, curiosity. Mostly curiosity, like I was an exhibit, not a person. My hands trembled as I reached for the letter. The envelope was soft, worn at the edges like it had been read and reread, or maybe clutched in his restless hands late at night. I didn't know. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Part of me wanted to flee, to disappear, and never find out, but something heavier than fear kept me there. I needed to know. I needed to see what he'd left behind for me. I took a breath that barely reached my lungs, turned to face the room that hated me, and broke the seal.
I wasn't ready.
Not really. I opened it anyway. Not because I was brave, but because after everything that had happened, I think I owed him at least this much. The paper inside unfolded like it might crumble in my hands, the edges yellowed, as if it had been waiting a long, long time to be read. As the seal cracked open, all I could think about was how we ended, not with a fight worthy of a movie, not even a proper goodbye, just silence. A slow erosion that left us strangers overnight. But before I could tell them what the letter said, I realized I had to tell them about us first, about the mess, the love, the wreckage, the everything, because letters don't make sense without the story behind them. And if this story touches something in you, if it makes you pause and feel something real, I'd be grateful if you'd take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Not because this is about numbers, but because these stories, these fragile, bruised truths deserve to be heard by someone who might need them. And if that someone is you, I hope you'll stay. Now, where was I? My name is Lauren Parker. I was 21 when I met Ethan Sullivan, and back then, I was the kind of girl who laughed too loud in quiet places and made wishes on every single shooting star, no matter how ridiculous they seemed. I believed the world was something you could wrap your arms around if you just stretched wide enough. Ethan wasn't like that. He was the kind of man who kept his storms tucked away behind a still, unrateable gaze, a man who spoke in silences more often than in words, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what drew me to him in the first place, the way he carried his shadows like a second skin, never asking anyone to peel them back. There was a gravity to him, a quiet intensity that pulled me in and kept me tethered even on days when I should have let go. He looked at me like he saw something no one else had ever bothered to notice, like maybe beneath all my noisy bravado, I was just as lost as he was. We spent 4 years together, 4 chaotic, beautiful, soul-crushing years that left me breathless and hollow in equal measure. I won't lie and tell you it was perfect. It was anything but. Some days we were two satellites drifting in separate orbits, too far apart to even catch each other's reflection, while other days we burned like wildfire, like we were made from the same spark, and if we touched, the whole world might catch flame. On those days, I told myself we were soulmates. Maybe I believed it. Maybe I needed to believe it. But that story unraveled in the last year, slowly, painfully, like a thread pulled loose in the dark when you're too tired to notice, until the whole thing falls apart in your hands. Ethan began to disappear, not in the way you expect someone to leave, not with packed bags or slammed doors, but with the kind of absence that sits in the passenger seat beside you, while you pretend not to notice. He stopped letting me in. His eyes, once deep pools I loved to drown in, became empty windows staring through me like I wasn't even there. He stopped holding my hand in crowded rooms, stopped laughing at the stupid jokes I told to fill the spaces where conversation used to live, and worst of all, he stopped saying he loved me like it meant something, like I still mattered. And I started breaking under the weight of that emptiness, like a dam holding back water it could no longer contain, and no matter how many ways I tried to patch the cracks, through therapy appointments he never attended, long talks that turned into monologues, through giving him space and then crowding it, through tears that tasted like defeat, and silences that stretched into eternity, nothing worked. One night, when the quiet between us felt suffocating enough to drown in, I packed a single overnight bag, left the apartment key on the kitchen table beneath the half-finished mug of his cold coffee, and walked away into the night. It remains the hardest thing I've ever done. My mother told me I was doing the right thing, that I couldn't keep setting myself on fire to keep him warm, and I nodded, because that was the answer that made sense, the one that allowed me to sleep at night. But even so, for months, years really, I'd lie awake wondering if I'd left too soon, if I'd walked away from someone who just needed more patience, more time, more love. 2 years passed. I didn't see him again, didn't hear from him, didn't even glimpse him by accident in the places we used to haunt, until last week when the call came. It was Brooke Sullivan, Her voice was flat, brittle like ice cracking underfoot, and she didn't waste time on pleasantries or questions about how I was. She simply said, "Ethan's gone. The funeral's Friday. Don't come." The line went dead before I could respond. But I went anyway, not for them, not for closure, but for the boy I'd met at 21, the boy I still dreamed about in the quiet hours before dawn, the boy I still clung to in the version of us that could have been something more, something better. I thought maybe walking through that church door would be the only way to finally let him go. I wasn't foolish enough to expect kindness from the people gathered there, and I certainly didn't expect forgiveness. But I also didn't expect to be handed a letter, his letter, in front of every single person who wanted to see me unravel. As I held it in my trembling hands, that old familiar voice in the back of my mind whispered all the terrible things I'd buried deep. What if he hated me? What if this letter was his final indictment, his last cruel truth? What if I really had been the reason he gave up? The envelope was heavier than it looked, heavy not in ounces, but in meaning, in what it might say about me, about him, about us. I could feel Brooke's stare slicing into my skin from across the pews, and Mrs. Sullivan's whispered bitterness floated in the air behind me like a curse. The priest stepped back, his face grave, his gesture clear. This was mine to face alone. I was alone with Ethan, one last time, and I hadn't even dared open the letter yet. When I finally broke the seal, the soft tear of the envelope sounded like thunder in that suffocating, still room. My hands shook as I unfolded the letter, my breath catching somewhere between my ribs and my throat. But I didn't read the words right away. I stared at them, at the familiar slant of his handwriting, those lazy looping whiz that once graced notes left on my bathroom mirror, scribbled "I miss you" post-its on the fridge, now staring back at me from a letter that would be his last words. This wasn't one of those notes. This wasn't a sweet nothing or an apology scribbled in a rush. This was the final chapter of a story we both failed to finish. And still, the room waited, eyes boring into me, hungry to hear what kind of reckoning Ethan Sullivan had penned for the girl who walked away. Some faces were twisted in suspicion, others raw with anger, and a few, like Father Reynolds's, softened by something closer to sorrow than condemnation. My throat clenched tight, my tongue heavy and useless, my mouth dry as dust. I blinked hard once, twice, refusing to cry. Not yet. Not in front of them. I stole a glance toward Brooke. Her jaw was locked so tightly I could see the tension vibrating in her bones, arms crossed, like she was bracing to lunge at me if I so much as flinched. My stomach knotted, and the guilt, sharp and merciless, crashed over me again. Maybe I shouldn't have come. Maybe I didn't deserve to read this. The words echoed in my head like a curse. I thought back to the last night I saw Ethan, the night we sat in his old silver Honda, parked outside my apartment while the kind of soft, melancholy rain fell, the kind that makes everything feel heavier, more permanent. He wouldn't look at me. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the windshield, while I, exhausted and desperate, pleaded with him to give me something, anything to hold on to. I remember whispering, "I can't keep fighting for us if you won't meet me halfway," and I remember the way he didn't flinch, didn't look at me when he said, "Maybe I don't want to be fought for anymore." I don't think I ever recovered from that. I left the car that night and packed my life into a suitcase the next morning, walking away without looking back. So maybe Brooke was right. Maybe I did break him, or maybe he was already breaking, and I just wasn't enough to stop it. The cruelest part of loving someone who fades slowly is you don't even realize they're gone until they're already too far to reach. And when they finally are gone in the most irreversible way, all you're left with is a heap of maybes and what-ifs that smother you in the dark. The priest stepped forward again, a gentle hand brushing my elbow, his voice barely above a whisper as he said, "Take your time," as if he could feel the tremble in my bones, the way my body seemed seconds from crumbling right there at the altar. I nodded even though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. Read the letter now, wait until I could breathe again. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no later. There never really is. The letter was in my hands. The room was waiting, and if I didn't open my mouth soon, I might never find the courage again. And so, with my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and the hollow ache in my chest, I did the only thing left to do, the thing that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. I drew in a long, unsteady breath, one that shook on its way in and felt heavier on its way out. And finally, I began to read. Lauren, I said, aloud this time, my voice splintering under the weight of his handwriting, his words, his ghost. If you're hearing this, I'm already gone. The words hung in the air like a verdict, stealing what little oxygen was left in that stifling sanctuary, and I heard the collective inhale ripple through the room, a subtle but undeniable shift in the air, as if even they, even Brooke, who until now had anchored herself in rigid rage, couldn't help but flinch at the raw finality of it. She moved slightly in her seat, and it was the first time she had moved at all since I walked in. I kept reading, though my eyes dared to skip ahead just a few lines, needing to know what came next, needing to prepare for the knife I was certain was waiting for me somewhere inside that envelope. But what I found wasn't what I or anyone in that room expected. My hands trembled as I spoke the next line, and my voice cracked under the strain. Please don't let them turn you into the villain in my story. For a moment I was frozen, the words blurred on the page as if they might rearrange themselves into something more familiar, more damning, but they didn't. They remained still, permanent, irreversible. I glanced up, as if on instinct alone, and my eyes collided with Brooke's. For the first time since I crossed the threshold of that church, her expression faltered. She wasn't furious anymore, or at least, not only that. There was confusion now, uncertainty, like maybe the script she had clung to for 2 years didn't match the words spilling from Ethan's letter. And that crack in her armor gave me the tiniest flicker of courage, a threadbare lifeline in a sea of hostility, and I clung to it. I swallowed hard, forced down the knot in my throat, and pressed forward. You left because you had to, I read, my voice steadier now, though each word scraped against old wounds I thought had scarred over. Because I wouldn't let you love me the way you needed to. I see that now. I think I always did. My breath hitched, and I paused longer than I meant to, my fingers gripping the letter so tightly the paper began to crinkle and crease under the strain. But I didn't care. For the first time in 2 years I was hearing him, not the version of him I argued with in my head at night, not the distant shadow he'd become in my memories, but him. And what I heard wasn't the blame I had braced for, it wasn't resentment. It was something gentler, something that sounded a lot like understanding. A laugh escaped me, low and shaky, the kind that hurts more than it relieves, hollow in its release. I thought this letter would be a knife, I whispered. Mostly to myself, because for a fleeting moment, I forgot the room even existed. But it feels more like a bandage. Maybe I said it out loud because the weight of the moment was too heavy to hold in silence. Or maybe because Ethan's words cracked something open inside me that I had been trying to bury since the day I walked out. The priest, perhaps sensing the shift, stepped back, giving me space. Not just for me, but for Ethan's voice to fill the room as it never had while he was alive. I looked down again and continued, my voice clearer now, though my hands still shook. There are things I never said to you, I read. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. You asked me to open up, and I shut you out. That wasn't your fault, Lauren. That was me, afraid of being seen. A quiet sob echoed from the back of the church, soft and unplaceable. Maybe a cousin, maybe a stranger, but it wasn't Brooke. Not yet. But you saw me anyway. I kept going, and it scared the hell out of me. That line cracked something inside me, something brittle and aching, and for a brief, fragile moment, I pressed the letter against my chest just to steady myself, to keep from falling apart in front of a room full of people who still saw me as nothing but a scar on Ethan Sullivan's story. But even in death, he saw me, maybe more clearly than he ever did in life. I glanced toward Mrs. Sullivan. Her face was still carved from stone, her gaze fixed somewhere above me, as if looking at me might break whatever fragile composure she still had. But her hands, once clenched into fists, had relaxed. Her posture had softened, ever so slightly, and somehow that was enough. I stepped closer to the altar, my voice carrying stronger now, though my heart still pounded like it might burst from my chest. I don't want you to carry my darkness like it's yours, I read. That's why I left this letter, so you'd know the truth. You didn't break me, Lauren. I was already broken. And that was the line that changed everything. It was as if the very air in the room shifted, becoming less brittle, less suffocating, more like the stunned hush after a storm has passed. Brooke blinked hard and looked away. Father Reynolds exhaled a long, slow breath, as if even he hadn't been expecting Ethan's words to sound like this. I folded the letter carefully, deliberately, my hands finally steady for the first time since I'd stepped inside that church. And somehow, the choice to come here so agonizing just hours ago now felt right. Not easy, not without pain, but necessary. I turned to face the crowd who had once stared at me like an intruder, a mistake, and realized what I hadn't been able to before. Ethan hadn't written this letter for closure. He'd written it for me. For forgiveness. My forgiveness. I stood there, silent, holding the letter against my chest, unsure what came next, because the letter was no longer just paper in my hands. It was warmth, it was release, it was Ethan's last offering. The room, once thick with accusation, now held a different kind of silence, not empty but full, like everyone inside had exhaled the breath they hadn't even realized they were holding. I scanned the room slowly. Faces that once held nothing but judgment now wavered with uncertainty. Some were streaked with tears, others averted their eyes as if ashamed of how quickly they had believed the worst of me. But it was Brooke I sought, and when I found her, she wasn't sitting anymore. She was standing, arms loose at her sides, fingers twitching like she had something to say, but didn't know where to start. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity before she finally whispered, her voice so cracked, so raw, I almost didn't recognize it. Why didn't he ever say any of that to us? The words fractured something inside both of us, and I didn't have an answer. I wasn't sure there ever was one. I had asked myself that same question 100 times when we were together. Why won't you let me in, Ethan? But Ethan wasn't the kind of person who let his pain spill out into the open. He kept it tucked away in dark corners, like broken glass in a drawer, hidden from sight but cutting him all the same. I think he wanted to protect you, I said finally, my voice soft but sure. All of you. Brooke didn't reply. She simply nodded, just once, like maybe that was the only answer she needed for now. As for Mrs. Sullivan, I don't know if she forgave me in that moment, maybe she never will, but when I caught her dabbing her cheek with the sleeve of her black dress, and saw the hard line of her jaw soften, just enough to let a crack of something human through, I understood that maybe, just maybe, it was enough. The priest, clearing his throat softly, stepped toward the altar once more, his hands folded gently in front of him, his voice carrying a reverence that felt almost unnecessary now. We were going to end the service with a prayer, he said, his tone hushed, almost as if the church itself demanded a softer touch after everything that had just unfolded. But I believe Ethan's words, they were more than enough. A few heads nodded, others bowed solemnly, as though they too acknowledged that no prayer could match the raw, unfiltered truth Ethan had left behind in ink and paper. I remained where I was, unmoving, the letter still pressed tightly against my heart, like armor forged from words and memory, letting the moment settle into my skin, into the hollow spaces I had carried for so long. I had thought walking into that church would be the hardest thing I'd ever do, had braced myself for the weight of their hatred, their whispered condemnations, and in many ways it had nearly broken me. But standing there now, wrapped in Ethan's last words, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel for years. I wasn't shattered. I wasn't hollow. I was somehow whole. For the first time in so long, I wasn't drowning under the suffocating weight of what-ifs, or the relentless ache of maybe I should haves. I had the truth now. His truth, and it reshaped everything I thought I knew, peeling back layers of guilt I had worn like a second skin. As the congregation began to disperse, the air shifted again. Some glanced at me with cautious nods. Others lowered their gaze, no longer cold or judgmental, but quiet in a way that felt almost respectful. No words were exchanged, but their silence was different now, less condemning, more uncertain, as if they were beginning to question the story they had so eagerly believed. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the sky still a heavy, pewter gray, though there was a softness along the edges, a faint light trying to push its way through the clouds. The breeze caught my hair, tugged gently at the edges of the letter, as I carefully folded it back into the envelope that had carried it to me like a lifeline. Brooke followed, her footsteps silent on the stone steps, her presence lingering just behind me without a word. She stood beside me, arms crossed, holding herself tight against the cold, though I suspected the chill came from something deeper than the autumn wind. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, like dragging something jagged across her throat. I I hated you, she said, the words heavy, brittle, like it cost her something just to say them aloud. I didn't flinch. I met her words the way they deserved. I know, I replied, softly, evenly. She paused, her lips pressing together before she whispered, I don't, anymore. I think, I just didn't know the whole story. We didn't smile. There was no relief, no warmth in the way we stood there side by side. But there was understanding now, and maybe for both of us that was enough. I didn't follow them to the burial. It wasn't that I didn't care, or that the finality of the graveside goodbye wasn't important, but I had already said my goodbye the only way Ethan needed me to, in front of everyone, through his own words, and in that, I think, was his last gift to me. I stayed outside the church long after the crowd had disappeared, after the sounds of conversation and rustling coats had faded into nothingness, leaving only the hush of an empty street and a sky that hung low, thick with clouds that couldn't quite decide whether to rain or clear. I found comfort in that in-between, in that suspended quiet that mirrored how I felt inside. Not broken, not healed, just somewhere in between. I sat on the edge of the cold stone steps, the letter cradled in my lap, smoothing the worn creases with my fingertips. I didn't reread it, not yet. I simply held it, let it rest against my hands like a pulse I could no longer feel in him, but somehow still felt in me. It struck me then how he could never bring himself to say any of it while he was alive, but even so, he had wanted me to know. And it made me wonder, how many of us carry the things we can't say? How many people walk away before they realize they were loved all along? How many apologies get buried under pride, under fear, before they ever see daylight? The truth is, Ethan had been lost long before I walked away, but I had carried that loss like it was my fault to bear, like I was responsible for patching the cracks in him that had nothing to do with me. I let that guilt sink into my bones, drag me down, keep me small for 2 whole years. But now I could finally breathe, not because he let me off the hook, but because in the end, he saw me, truly saw me, and that was more powerful than any forgiveness I thought I needed from him. A few days after the funeral, when the ache had dulled into something quieter, Brooke called. Not a text, not an email, an actual call. And I almost didn't pick up, my hand hovering over the screen like answering might undo the fragile truce we had found. But I did. She didn't say much. Brooke never was one for unnecessary words. But she told me she had been thinking about the letter, about the things she never knew, and she wondered if she could read it again, if I'd be willing to share it. I told her I would. I mailed her a copy the next morning. We haven't become close. I don't know if we ever will, but the walls between us have come down, and sometimes that's all healing really needs. A little space where there used to be silence. I also started writing again. It was something I had abandoned when Ethan and I ended, as though losing him meant losing the part of me that believed in stories worth telling. I thought the best chapter of my life had closed the day I walked away, and that everything afterward would be nothing but blank, empty pages. But I've come to understand something I didn't back then. Pain doesn't end a story. It just changes its tone. And Ethan, he wasn't the final chapter. He was the chapter that made the story deeper, more complicated, more human. He was the lesson I didn't know I needed. So if you're still holding on to something heavy, if you're loving someone who doesn't know how to love you back, let them go gently, but hold on to the truth, because love doesn't always look like forever. Sometimes it looks like walking into a room full of people who despise you and reading a letter that quiets them more than any argument ever could. Sometimes love is the thing we leave behind, and sometimes it's the thing that finally sets us free.